From this view, the truth is undeniable. Vancouver Island is losing its soul. What if your paradise became a wasteland? That's the story unfolding here. Look at this mountain. Its forest crown is gone, stripped away by industrial logging. The surrounding hills, clear-cut by a private company, have suffered the same fate. The consequences? Devastation to streams, rivers, and aquatic life downstream. But a new vision could save it. In this video, we'll uncover the truth behind industrial logging's impact on water systems. And we'll share the findings of a local expert who studied the shocking results of logging in this region. Then we'll talk about how you can be part of the change. First, let's take a look at the Sable River watershed. The Sable River flows into the Strait of Georgia, part of the Pacific Ocean. But look closer at the land surrounding it. The bare patches of land are clear-cuts which span thousands of hectares. In the 1930s and 40s, 90% of the primary forest was logged. And from the 1990s to the present, 70% of second growth was logged. Some cut blocks appear a lighter green because vegetation has regrown. But they're still far from a healthy forest. Here's what some of those green areas look like on the ground. Here's the devastation up close. This mountaintop has no forest left to manage the water. Snow melts rapidly under the sun, unchecked by shade. When it rains, the trees are no longer there to slow the rainfall, absorb it, or protect the soil. The damage is systemic. Without roots to stabilize the soil, erosion increases. Without organic matter like leaf litter, water absorption plummets. Machinery compacts the soil, turning it into fine particles that flow into waterways, carrying sediment downstream. Look at this picture of the river in November showing high turbidity, which means there's a lot of sediment in the water, which is damaging and sometimes fatal to aquatic life. Logging roads only make it worse, carving pathways for sediment to flow directly into streams and rivers. This is Dave Weaver. With 37 years in forestry, Dave resigned from being a registered professional forester in 2016 to free his voice. Today he's volunteering with the Beaufort Watershed Stewards, using his expertise to assess the health of watersheds like the Sable. In 2023, Dave and his grassroots group conducted a scientific assessment of the cumulative impacts of logging in this watershed. He used BC's Watershed Cumulative Effects Protocol. His findings are alarming.
So here we are. There's the Sable River. This is an oblique satellite image looking, if you were hovering in a helicopter or a balloon over top of Damen Island. You can see Buckley Bay. It's a big watershed, about 10,000 hectares. Goes right from the beach all the way up to about 1,200 meters, I believe, something like that. It's all privately owned by corporation, and so it operates under the Private Managed Forest Land Act, basically from Highway 19 all the way up to the Alpine. There's a photograph of where we do our samples, a little different than that Agua Cafe shot I showed you there. That's in the summer when the flow is much lower, and it's a beautiful stream, or river, I should say. And the reference point, my wife Rose suggested, we gotta have some sort of reference, like people can relate to. And what's about the same size of that watershed that people relate to? And I don't know if she should suggest it. I guess I should say she suggested that, but it looked like Damen and Hornby. It's roughly about the same, the net area of that watershed is about the same as Damen and Hornby. So I can kind of relate to it that way. Remember that, I've got a couple of slides on that. So we got right to the results, that's pretty quick. So this is what I found out. Those have the 6 indicators that they call it across the top, and there'll be metrics within those indicators. So it's things that we actually measure on the ground or measure on GIS for each indicator. So you can see that this is very directly related to logging. So there's road density, basically kilometers per square kilometer, road density within 100 meters of a stream, road density on unstable slopes, so that's all slopes above 60%. Number of crossings, wherever a road crosses one of those streams that we've mapped out, tally those. Riparian disturbance means the protected areas, how much is disturbed, or they log straight through. We had to interpret that from satellite images, and I had to field check them. And then peak flow, this is the complicated one. And this is what Dr. Ali is, who's going to speak on this tour in Vancouver, advocates, that equivalent clear-cut area is not everything in the health in the watershed. It's just a part of it. So peak flow is a function of the size of the watershed, its elevation grade, where the wetlands are, the sort of configuration, a real geomorphological one. There's about 9 metrics in there. But one of them, which is most important, is how much is in a clear-cut equivalent state. Now, I'm not going to explain that tonight, especially for this side of the room. This side might get it. I'm not too sure, but that's another talk. I've oriented, of the 6 indicators, those 4 that are elevated along the H line are in the high category. The ones that came out on the bottom are in the low category. And for the left side of the room, here are the indicator values. And this side of the room, don't look at those. That's not going to work. But just to give you a context, look at the roads. And being probably the easiest indicator and the easiest metric to measure, you can see that it knocks it out of the park. The threshold for a high is 2.3 kilometers per square kilometer. It doesn't mean too much, but for the Sable, it was 3.7. So there's a ton of roads. When you get a ton of roads, you get a ton of logging. When you get a ton of logging, you get a lot of impact on hydrological and aquatic habitat. You can see for peak flow, it's a ratio. It's not really because it has so many metrics. The threshold for high is about 0.42, and this was 0.6. So again, it's in the high category. So I'm just going to highlight those 2 indicators and give you an example. This is where I'm looking under the hood a little bit and to show you some of the detail, only on 2 points. The first one is road density. And you see those images of Denman Island. That's the outline of Denman Island and Hornby, which is equivalent area, as I showed earlier, to the Sable River. And there's 306 kilometers of road that we could detect from GIS later. That's the equivalent of driving 16 times from the north end of Denman Island to the south. That's a lot of road.
Here's why it's a problem. As road densities increase, they expose more surface materials to erosion, leading to sediment being carried into waterways. Also, because roads resist water infiltration, they create more surface water runoff, which can increase peak flows. During heavy rain or snow melting events, high levels of water and sediments are diverted to streams via forestry roads and ditch lines.
The second metric was equivalent clear-cut area, or a metric out of the peak flow. It's 4,832 hectares of equivalent clear-cut area. So basically, 58% of that watershed has its hydrological interception disturbed. So that's the equivalent of all of Denman Island being in a clear-cut state, except for the lower part where Boyle Point Park is. So that gives you a bit of a context what's going on in the Sable.
Peak flow refers to the time when the most water flows through a stream, usually during heavy rain or snowmelt. It's a key concern because up to 80% of the year's water passes through during this period. Managing peak flow is critical to avoid issues like flooding, erosion, unstable stream channels, or dangerous debris flows, which can damage bridges, culverts, and downstream ecosystems.
Here's the final result. Sable River, there's a final assessment for the watershed. It's a function of these 3 components. Again, I'm following this protocol, this scientific protocol, to the letter. Each component, water quality, water quantity, ecosystem function, has a rating, and it's a bit of a mix of all those indicators. Won't go into that. With high risk in the roads, it basically bumps all of those components into a high risk. And then for the overall watershed, you end up with a high risk, as I'm going to quote here, a high potential of negatively impacting natural state of hydrological processes. So it's a risk rating. It's not for sure. It's not like Sable is really messed. It just has a high risk based on all of these assessments. And the recommendation, when you have a high risk like this in the watershed, again, right out of this protocol, just you need to adjust development activities. The only major development activity in the Sable River is logging. But don't believe me. There's 2 other studies I was able to dig up that showed that the Sable is also in somewhat of a high risk. And 2 of those publications. The province did their own course assessment. They never published this. This is data that I was able to get from my contact in Victoria for some of my relationships when I worked there. And they did do a course assessment, just strictly using GIS for all of them, and they came up with the Sable as a moderate to high. That's number one there. The second one is the Pacific Salmon Foundation. In 2024, did a habitat pressures assessment. And they published this one. I have the link for that one. And they came up with mostly high rating for spawning habitat in the Sable. So both of these studies show that the Sable has some issues. We'll leave it at that, some issues. And the primary development in the Sable is logging. If we draw a line down the middle of that image, the left-hand side, the rate of harvest is off the scale. The right-hand side, and I'll explain why the right-hand side a little bit later, why that is. This is just north of the Sable River. It's all on private land, and most of it embraces the next watershed I'm going to assess. So I got three things here that will look different. It'll look different because the size, or I should say the rate of harvest on the land base will look more like the right. I'm advocating 30%, less than 30% cover loss. That's a real threshold for biodiversity, for hydrological health, and many aspects of the health of the watershed, 30%. That's a good one. And obviously the clear-cut size will come down. Look at the size of that clear-cut on the left-hand side. That's 290 hectares. That's the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about, when I talk to industry, when I talk to government, they don't want to talk about the rate of harvest on the Private Managed Forest Land Act. That is the elephant in the room, and we have to change that. Langley Lake Langley Lake Watershed is actually that around where that 8-hectare clear cut. That's why it's not logged as intensely as the left-hand side. And the reason is because the Private Managed Forest Land Act actually has some rigor around a licensed water intake. That's where they take their water for Union Bay, comes out of Langley Lake. So they have to log lighter. It has to be a lighter footprint. And so it can be done. But isn't every watershed in BC a community watershed?
Yeah.
Is it not?
Yeah.
I want to hear yes in the room.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Every watershed is a community watershed because it doesn't matter if it's people, if it's wildlife, if it's fish, it's a community of something. So we have to think that way.
In the assessment report, Dave highlighted critical findings from the Forest Practices Board, a third-party forestry auditor in BC, which since 2006 has investigated 27 complaints, conducted 8 special investigations, and completed 3 compliance audits on how forest management affects water. These efforts revealed 3 significant issues that demand our attention. 1. There are no legal requirements to assess or consider cumulative effects of forest practices in most watersheds in BC. 2. Current forest practices contribute sediment into streams. 3. Historical forest practices continue to negatively affect water. Industrial logging has carved a corridor of destruction stretching across Vancouver Island for hundreds of kilometers, negatively affecting water, wildlife, and biodiversity. But this doesn't have to be the future. There's a coalition of people across British Columbia mobilizing to rewrite forestry laws. The Power of Forest Project is working to refine a new Forest Act, and there are also people working to make changes to the Private Managed Forest Land Act that governs most logging on Vancouver Island. These are initiatives that could protect and help restore ecosystems like the Sable River and ensure a future for communities and nature alike. Want to be part of the change? Watch more of our videos, share this story, subscribe to our YouTube channel and newsletter. Links are in the description. Join us in advocating for a better future. Together, we can protect what's left of Vancouver Island's soul.